Welcome to History Lessons for Misanthropes. I'm Dr. Mildred Strange, and this is a bonus episode. And not only am I joined by Lou, I'm also joined by a very special guest, Dr. Jordan. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. So Jordan is a postdoctoral candidate at the University of Chicago and is the Guggenheim Fellow at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, which means a lot of things for those who are academically inclined. Very prestigious, very impressive. But for all intents and purposes, he is a space historian, which is
awesome.
Yeah. It's a pretty rad field of study, and just kind of nice to show that you can be a historian of anything. Not that sounds like I'm diminishing your field of study. But yeah, I mean, there's the history of space, so why not study it?
Totally. And within the universe of space history, I tend to focus specifically on the human and biological aspects of space history. And this is an area that usually hasn't gotten a lot of attention. Normally, the space history folks tend to be really interested in technology, like rockets, for example, got a lot of attention for a long time. And sort of the biological life sciences side is something that is really interesting to me and hasn't had a lot of work done on it. So that's my specific area of study.
Yeah, I guess apart from the Laika, the space dog and some monkey stuff, there isn't much, I'd say, knowledge in the general readership, general listenership, the general population of the biological part of space history.
Exactly. You know, we love astronauts and we're sort of fascinated by them, but we never really sort of take the next step to say, what's the history of the astronaut? Where does this type of person come from? Who's in charge of selecting them and essentially making them? So these are the questions that I have sort of dedicated my career to, and definitely have a mission to try and get those histories out into more mainstream venues like this podcast.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's sort of the space equivalent of what I do, you know, just the people who are part of the process rather than the end product itself. I should also just say that we are recording at my house today because Lou is in the process of moving, so you may hear cats in the background. My cats are incredibly vocal and demanding, so specifically Grimalkin is currently playing with her favorite toy and will demand we play with her. So there will be cats in the background. So do you have any thoughts or questions before we begin, Lou? Or?
No, I read the article preemptively.
Yeah, Jordan was gracious enough to send us a recent article that just came out this week.
And correct? I'm afraid to jump the gun on some stuff. So I really dug it, partially because it ties into one of my favorite subjects, which is Operation Paperclip. But yeah, take it away.
Yeah, it was an easy 45-page read, which sounds like I'm, again, putting you down. But no, it was a very, very easy and fast and interesting. Some academic articles feel like work, and this didn't feel like work.
That's high praise. I really, really appreciate that.
Yeah, so take it away. Teach us about the thing. Do the thing.
Oh, yeah. So just talk about the article a bit?
Yeah.
Sure.
So, because it is sort of adjacent to Operation Paperclip, which I don't know if you want to explain what that is, and then kind of get into how it's adjacent to.
Sure. Well, a lot of people know about Operation Paperclip as this, effective World War II, where the United States and a number of the other allied nations entered into sort of a competition in the closing days of World War II to secure both experts from Nazi Germany and material that they had been working on, most famously the V-2 rocket. And the team that designed and built that, of which Wernher von Braun was sort of the most famous. And all those scientists were brought to America, where they were basically absolved from any sort of war crime.
Right.
And shielded from investigations, essentially. They didn't have to go to Nuremberg to stand trial and face face justice for the things that they had done during the war. But a lot of people kind of know that story, but they sort of focus on Wernher von Braun and his rocket team. And they think that, okay, yeah, there was, this Nazi force within the U.S. space program, but they sort of limit it to like one personality, maybe a team of people and one technology, the rocket, and that Nazis built the rockets that took us to the moon. That's true, but it was a much far-ranging operation than that. Over 1,500 German scientists came to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, and they weren't all rocket scientists. They went into all aspects of the military-industrial complex, different branches of the U.S. military, and then later NASA when NASA was formed, also private companies as well, contractors, that sort of thing. Anytime in the Cold War, you can sort of investigate some aspect of U.S. military science and technology, and you will find people participating in Operation Paperclip wherever you look. They're everywhere. So the story that I've focused on are the life scientists, the physiologists, the medical doctors, the psychologists who were brought from Nazi Germany, mostly from the Luftwaffe, where they had specialized in a field called aviation medicine, which was concerned with selecting and protecting, Luftwaffe fighter pilots. And then they were taken and installed in the U.S. Air Force, and they formed the nucleus of a new field there called space medicine. And space medicine is the field concerned with selecting and protecting humans for the outer space environment, essentially astronauts. So, many people know the story about Wernher von Braun building America's space rockets, but they don't know that another team of Nazi scientists essentially built the astronaut that would ride inside those rockets.
Yeah, I found it really interesting while reading the article that the physiology of astronauts was obviously very important, and a particular type of person needs, the physical requirements of someone going into space and enduring that sort of environment, both physically and mentally, and the lack of gravity and the being in a small enclosed space with a few people for a long time,
G-force, all that stuff.
Yeah. Is. At one point in the article, you say that they were looking for the qualities of the Superman, which kind of is exactly what the Nazi scientists were doing with the Übermensch.
They called it what was it? The Optiman?
Yeah. So, couple things going on there. Yeah. So Bruno Belki, who was the Nazi mountaineer scientist who got brought over from Germany and installed in the U.S. Air Force School of Aviation Medicine and ran the experiment that is the focus of the article. He wrote in one of his very early articles on astronauts that the search for the astronaut was the search for the Superman. So he used the term Superman explicitly to describe the astronaut. And there's no coincidence there that that term has a cultural history that goes, back to Nietzsche and had a huge sort of compatibility with Nazi ideology and became central to the Third Reich's ideas. So to find that term in U.S. Air Force space medicine literature circa 1959 is both like surprising, but also not super surprising when you kind of know the backstory to where these experts came from and the cultural milieu in which they gained their initial expertise that they then brought over to the United States. And Optiman is a sort of adjacent idea, and that comes out a little bit later in the 1960s. And that is the idea of a human that is essentially prepared for space, not by having like all these technologies attached to them that help them tolerate the space environment, but that has been acclimatized instead. So instead of adding, technological implants to, make it so you don't need to breathe the air or something that needs to be taken along, an Optiman type of creature would be pre-acclimatized to somehow not need oxygen. So these are theoretical ideas, but they have bearing on how we understand humans both in space and on Earth as well.
Yeah, that's crazy to think that the human body can be adapted in that way. That the human body is so malleable. Obviously, it's theoretical and hasn't been achieved since people who go into space need accoutrement.
They need training. They need to be of a certain. They need to take a certain threshold of punishment, so to speak. Sorry if I'm using layman's terms here, because I'm in the presence of someone who works with this stuff, and I'm like, Yeah, they're really good at their job.
Well, they are for sure. But what's interesting to note is that if you look back at the history of astronaut selection in general and like who have we chosen historically to be astronauts, like you can look at the first group of astronauts the U.S. selected, the Mercury 7, who were selected in 1959 for Project Mercury, and they are 7 white male military test pilots with degrees in engineering. They're all, around 5'9", and they basically look exactly identical. They're like interchangeable humans. The biggest difference is like their haircut and their what color of tie they are wearing in a photo.
Right.
And the idea that like space medicine experts had to figure out, the capabilities and limits of the human body in the space environment and then come up with this sort of ideal spacefaring body, and that these 7 white men and all the other astronauts after them who were selected, who were also white men, all the way up until, the late 1970s, which is the first time the U.S. selects visible minorities and women to the astronaut corps, shows that there's this cultural bias in there. It's not just given by the harsh extreme environment of outer space or the harsh extreme environment of the space cabin that protects you from that, or by the technology inside that. That's not determining this, cookie cutter white guy that's the astronaut all through the 1960s and 70s. It's this sort of cultural idea of who has power, who is the best, and who do we imagine to be the future of humanity. And part of my project of recovering these weird and wonderful histories is to basically problematize that, call attention to it, and say we need a different, better way of thinking about who belongs in space. We can't continue on this path, even though we have diversified. We are still on a path that starts with these Nazi scientists and starts with literally 7 or 8 classes selected of just white male military test pilots with degrees in engineering.
Right. Not to get too far off the wonderful and magical adventures of Balki, but that brings up an interesting point that were there, kind of just based on the fact that there were Nazi officers or Nazi scientists involved, were there plans for kind of breeding a perfect American space hero?
No, there were not, and that's really interesting because eugenics was such a major component of the Third Reich, and that of course is about controlled reproduction and directed reproduction in certain nefarious ways. The idea of reproduction in space was something that they sort of kicked the can down the road a little bit in the 1950s and 60s. They were really just trying to figure out how to basically get a soldier to survive a space flight and to be able to function and fulfill their sort of militaristic duty in outer space. And this idea of even including women was something that they talked about only in the margins of some of their more popular magazine articles and that sort of thing. Right. And they were sadly an afterthought and treated essentially almost like a joke. So the idea of that they would seriously think about the viability of human reproduction in space wasn't something that was happening. And it's also something that's sadly not really happening enough now. And we really do need to think about that, especially because there are people who are seriously planning, long-term missions to the moon and Mars.
Yeah.
So,
and we're on a dying planet.
Right. And do we want to fix the planet, or do we want to have some rich people escape the planet? So
no, we're going to be Venus too. We need to get off this rock. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about, I'm also delighted to hear that the pronunciation of his name is Balki, which reminds me of Perfect Strangers because you're in Chicago.
I had that thought too when I started working on this project.
I knew you were going to bring that up.
Come on.
Classic sitcom. Oh my gosh.
When I went to a conference in Chicago in 2015, I guess, and for the week leading up to it, I was just playing the Perfect Strangers theme song the entire time.
Can we use the Perfect Strangers theme song for the intro for this
I think
episode?
We'll get sued.
Well, we don't know unless we try. Worst happens, we'll get a cease and desist.
Well, we'll talk about it off air.
Okay.
So let's dive into the workings of Balki and what he was essentially trying to accomplish, and his weird exclusion by inclusion program.
Also, I mentioned this to Mildred before the episode, but reading your article, I kept thinking about how this whole story is a great comedy of failures, which could be done by the Coen brothers.
Yeah.
And I think you should be a consultant on that movie.
I mean, I would love to. I have a background in media and entertainment.
Yeah.
So, I do hope that one day, if I'm lucky enough to become, a full professor of space history someplace, that part of my job can be, dramaturge for science fiction movies and that sort of thing. That's definitely something I want to happen.
I forgot that Jordan used to write music reviews for, was it Now?
Yeah, Now Magazine.
Cool.
Also, theater criticism for them as well. Lots of interviews. I worked there for 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So on to the story of Balki and Corson Larry.
Right. Yes. So essentially, Balki was brought to the United States by Hubertus Strughold, who was the sort of the chief former Luftwaffe scientist that was in charge of the U.S. Air Force's space medicine program. And Strughold was really interested in bringing Balki over from Germany because Balki had experience in mountains and was an expert on what's called high altitude physiology. So what happens to your body when you kind of ascend into the sea of gases that presses down on us constantly, and how that lessening of pressure that our bodies are used to, how that creates problems for the bodies that can be fixed, potentially by this process of acclimatization that we know about from mountaineering and mountain climbing. So Balki was an expert in training people who might normally experience the effects of altitude sickness at certain elevations, usually above 10,000 feet, getting them to actually build up more tolerance to altitude. And he did this through a number of experiments that were performed in the Himalayas, especially on a mountain called Nanga Parbat, which was one of the tallest, is still today one of the tallest mountains in the Himalayas. And the studies that he did there on these sort of Nazi-funded German mountain climbing expeditions wasn't just to sort of understand, human limits and capabilities, and are we able to train humans to sort of operate better in these mountain environments. There was an explicit military application for the Luftwaffe, and their idea was, okay, if you can get a mountaineer to stay conscious at an altitude on a mountain that they normally wouldn't be able to be conscious at, you could maybe use that technique on a fighter pilot, and then that fighter pilot, when they're up in their plane, at that point planes didn't have pressurized cockpits, that pilot would be able to fly higher than their allied adversaries, and that would be what Balki called a great advantage in aerial combat. So during World War II, Balki eventually ended up starting one of these high altitude training stations in the Tyrolean Alps, where he trained Luftwaffe fighter pilots to become more altitude tolerant, and then they would go back to their bases and go fly against allied pilots, and for Balki at least hopefully emerge victorious due to his special altitude training. So when Strughold, the sort of head of German aviation medicine, was brought over to the US and installed at the US Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine in Texas, he saw that same problem could apply to astronauts. And it wasn't that astronauts were flying in aerial combat or anything like that, but this idea was that inside a spacecraft, you have an artificial environment, and that artificial environment can't be just what we experience at sea level. That's too difficult, too costly to replicate. It requires, the weight that's required to contain that atmosphere would be prohibitive to launching something into orbit, they thought. So what they wanted to do was use a thinner atmosphere inside the space capsule as like the normal interior artificial atmosphere. They wanted that atmosphere to be equivalent to about 14,000 feet. So like a pretty decent mountain summit. So he thought, hey, there's this expert that I know from my Luftwaffe days, Bruno Balki, knows about training people for mountain environments. Maybe he can be involved in determining how we can train future astronauts and select future astronauts for special sort of altitude tolerance. So that was when Balki talked about the Superman and finding the Superman, to be the astronaut. His superpower that he was really interested in was this ability to remain conscious at high altitudes that normally normal humans would fall unconscious and perhaps die.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly one of the reasons why there's bodies littered on Mount Everest, is because the human body, just if you're not trained and acclimatized to this high altitude, and you ignore from what I've heard, there are signs all the way up Everest being like, if you're experiencing this symptom, turn back now. If you're experiencing this symptom, turn back now. And people are just like, nope, they're going to power through, and then they die.
Those photos are gruesome.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of bodies. Because your average body that doesn't live, not to foreshadow, but the average body that lives at a lower altitude doesn't handle high altitudes very well.
Especially if you lived at lower altitudes through generations, you know?
Totally. And one of the first things that starts to happen to you at these high altitudes, one of the symptoms of altitude sickness is impaired judgment.
Right.
So, you know, when you get these sort of type A mountaineers and, you know, they're up there and they're experiencing these symptoms, they're not in the right state of mind to say, I should turn back and I should descend to a lower altitude. They have this sort of version of go fever where they just want to keep going for the summit. And there's all these different sort of sociological pressures that keep them up there when it's way too dangerous. And so, yeah, like you said, on Everest, above 26,000 feet is a portion of the mountain, basically the very top of it, from about 26,000 feet to 29,000 feet, which some mountaineers call colloquially the death zone. And that's the period above which, you know, when you're in that part of the mountain, the pressure is so low that your body just is not getting enough oxygen to live. It can keep itself alive for a period of time, but it's operating at a deficit and there's no way to recover from that. Some people are able to get to the top and back in time before their body dies. Most people need to take supplemental oxygen, but some people succumb. They either make a foolish decision and they slip and fall and they die that way, or they die due to asphyxiation, essentially anoxia.
Yeah. And picture you're exerting yourself. Mountain climbing isn't easy. Like a few weeks ago, my partner and I went on a hiking trip to the Niagara Escarpment and I was dying. And that's not that high. So if you imagine adding altitude to that, I'm also not as physically fit as someone who would be climbing Everest, but still you're exerting yourself and the atmosphere is thinner and it's a recipe for bad news.
I'm also unsure about one thing. Is it similar to something like the bends, or is it actually the bends?
It's not the bends. So the bends is actually nitrogen that gets absorbed into the tissues of your body, and that happens under extreme pressure.
Oh, and then it expands, and then that's not good.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's when you come out of a pressure situation. So, for example, a diver diving deep down will surface and feel fine for a little while, maybe half an hour, but then that nitrogen will start to bubble out, and they will get extreme pain in their joints, and that's where the name the bends comes from. Actually, is that people experiencing what they called chiasson sickness during the construction of bridges, which involved being in these high pressurized environments to lay the foundations underwater, would literally double over in pain, and that they were seen as bent, and that's why it was called the bends.
So this is kind of like the other side of the coin, but it's still just as bad.
So this is exactly. So these are both problems of pressure, and instead of super high pressure on a mountain, you're dealing with the absence of pressure. So the weight of the air that normally keeps your body in sort of the state that it evolved in to have its sort of normal processes is sort of taken away, and your body wants to balloon out and push out, and that's not good for a lot of different reasons. And you're not able to get enough oxygen, which is what keeps you alive.
Yeah. So it's kind of like how you take a deep sea creature and you bring it to the surface and it dies because it can't handle the lack of pressure. It's similar to that then. Correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Some of the first people who were interested in the problems of low pressure on mountains made the observation that we live at the bottom of a sea of air.
Right.
And when we go higher into the atmosphere, we are ascending to the quote unquote the surface.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny that we've evolved to just be in this very narrow range of comfort in terms of atmosphere, and leaving it in either direction is bad news bears.
Exactly. And what's this sort of takes us to the next part of this of the story then is that not all humans live at sea level, and
right. That's a very white Eurocentric view I just had there.
But most people do, and I don't think it's wrong to say that most people do live at sea level. But there are populations that live at altitude and have for generations. And Balki knew this, and that's what leads to sort of the colonial racist element of his study, which is that he became fascinated with the physical performance at altitude of this group of miners who lived in Morococha, Peru. These sort of high altitude indigenous people who had lived there for generations and had this sort of famous, remarkable tolerance to altitude up there. And so what he did is in the 1950s, with under a contract from the U.S. Air Force, he flew to Lima and then drove up into the mountains to Morococha, Peru, and studied these high altitude indigenous people. He put them in pressure chambers. He wanted to see how long they could stay conscious at different reduced pressures. So he would there'd be a pressure chamber already up on the mountain, and he would take them in there and he would suck out even more air, and he would see how long that they could either perform some sort of physical exertion task like pedaling a stationary bicycle, or he would just do a straight up like exposure to critical altitude and see how long they could remain conscious before they blacked out. And these are dangerous experiments. You're messing with people's respiration and with the vital gases that they need to live. Also, the people there were, vulnerable populations. They were employed by essentially an evil mining corporation called the Cerro de Pasco Mining Corporation, and their consent to participate in these risky experiments being conducted by like a legitimate Nazi doctor. There's no informed consent. There's no evidence anywhere that I could find in any archive that they were even told why they were doing this. They were just sort of pressured through their employer because the Cerro de Pasco Mining Corporation had this agreement with some physiologists from Lima, and they in turn had an agreement with the United States Air Force. So all of this ended up with these poor vulnerable people being put into a pressure chamber and studied by a Nazi doctor who was then going to use that to help make the American astronaut in a roundabout way.
Yeah, in your article, you mentioned that he refers to the indigenous people that he studied human material.
Yeah, that's creepy.
It's just, it's definitely kind of a very, it's tale as old as time. The indigenous people aren't seen as people who you need to get informed consent from. They are disposable. They are part of the deal of being colonizers. You get the people who are already on the land to use for your own evil doings. And it's just sort of like this prevailing attitude towards indigenous populations around the world from the colonizers on behalf of the colonizers.
And in your article, you used a term that I've never heard before, but it's really interesting, was biological appropriation.
Mm-hmm.
Where they wanted... You mentioned that Balki at one point wanted to see if he can like extract the source of what made them adaptable to these low pressure environments. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, exactly. One would think that maybe, if these people really did have this sort of advantage that was super relevant to spaceflight, that he would consider them as astronaut candidates, but he didn't. What he does is he says, you are interesting to me and I want to find out how you work, but I don't want to actually send you to space. I want to see how I can produce your ability in a white male soldier who I will send to space. And that person will be the future of humanity and not you.
It's comic book villain shit.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm so happy that you brought up that line, the human material, which I think comes from a Life magazine popularization of his research at the time. And that to me is just another continuation of sort of the Nazi politics when it comes to human experimentation and just sort of a low regard for life when it comes to certain groups of people. They elevated certain groups of people, and then they basically subhumanized other groups of people and saw them as essentially useful for whatever ends would help those elevated groups. So this is after the war. This is in the 1950s where he's doing these experiments. And he's still operating with those same politics in mind. And to me, that's part of that's at the heart of this story. These scientists who came over from the Luftwaffe, from Nazi Germany, they didn't check their politics at Ellis Island or, with the CIA or anything like that. They kept those and they put those into their work. And that work became the foundation of the US space program, whether it's a rocket or whether it's an astronaut. It's in there. And this is one of those moments where you can see there is this low regard for certain elements of humanity, treating them as useful and essentially creating two categories of, astronaut and non-astronaut that track onto sort of, colonizer and colonized, future and past, all these like problematic ideas. So, I think that's one of the hearts of the story. And some people, like to say, there's no problem with colonizing space or speaking about space colonialism because there's no one who lives in space, and that space is sort of this empty blank slate. And one of the ways that I push back on that very forcefully is that yes, you can actually go to space and go to Mars and the moon and act with a colonial mindset, and you can still repeat the mistakes of colonialism even if there's no one there. And the ways you do that is that you still enact colonial relationships on Earth to get you there, and then you also speak about and think about what you're doing within that colonial frame of mind. So part of the decolonization of space is something that a lot of different scholars in the social sciences and humanities who think about space are engaged with doing right now. And what I'm trying to do is bring the space history piece, the piece of the space history life sciences, to that conversation and add that this sort of example, this sort of empirical evidence of how this happens to basically help us learn and help us do future space better.
Help us get to the Starfleet phase.
Yeah, let's be Carl Sagan and let's not be Starship Troopers, right?
Let's be Carl Sagan and not Elon Musk, or Carl Sagan and not Werner von Braun.
Yeah. I love Carl Sagan, by the way.
Alumni of University of Chicago, both undergrad and PhD. Yeah,
your people.
Mm-hmm.
The lack of informed consent you mentioned in your article. Informed consent came about through Nuremberg.
Yeah.
And the fact that they didn't, and it's Belky's doing that. He didn't use informed consent. So for people who don't know, who have never done human participation, when you do research with animals or humans, there needs to be research ethics involved. And with humans, they need to give consent to participate, and they need to understand the goal of the study, the what they'll be enduring, the fact that they can tap out at any time if they're uncomfortable. And now universities go through a huge process. It's a pain in the dick to do research ethics. I had to do it to interview 2 corset makers who are currently alive. It was such a pain in the ass, but it's necessary. And it's an important part of research. And this partly came out of Nuremberg, and it wasn't just Balky's doing, it was the American space, or the American Air Force. His bosses weren't doing, they didn't have checks and balances to make sure that the research was all done above board. And it's sort of this, again, this prevailing attitude towards Indigenous people that Nuremberg created informed consent because the people that the Nazis were testing on were still white Europeans, by and large. So there's still this, this hierarchy of humanity that's being enacted through the American Air Force, and they're sort of turning a blind eye regarding informed consent.
Totally. And yeah, like I said before, there's no evidence at all that Balky practiced any sort of informed consent with the miners at Morikosha that he did these tests on, or that other scientists who were coming from America. Because basically what happened was there was this mining community, this evil mining corporation kept this village at high altitude to mine silver and copper, and they came under stunning rebuke for the treatment of their workers. Even in the early 20th century, there were already these massive, exposés of the poor treatment of the workers there. So what they did was they built hospital facilities up in this high altitude mining town, almost as a token thing that they could point to say, oh no, we have hospitals here for the workers. So, we can't be seen as evil as you portray us. And then what happened is that physiologists from Lima became interested in using those hospital facilities as research facilities to conduct high-altitude research. And then they started contracting out to other countries who want to basically come in, and they spoke about it in exactly these terms: rent a population to study. Yeah, it's nuts. And this is happening after Nuremberg. This is happening after the doctor's trial. And this is happening after the so-called supposed retreat from race after World War II, where we think science sort of jettisons this concept of race because the Nazis showed it to be so toxic. It, in fact, endures in all of these different ways. A number of different historians of science have tracked how race endures in all these different ways. Joanna Radin's work, Vanessa Heggie's work, people like that. And this is another example of that continuation, the lingering of race in these types of studies.
And the type of person who should be protected, or the populations who have the ability to speak back. Like if you're in a mining community in the Andes and this is your livelihood, and speaking out about against the company renting you out for experiments is going to not only lose your job, but make your entire family starve. You're
also, you can't tell people on TikTok back then. Like, you can't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's no recourse, and there's all these different incentives to not rock the boat, and these people were not free, essentially.
Yeah.
They just weren't, and
it's
they
like
were
an indentured, not quite slavery, but not quite free, like that. Exactly. Indentured gray space.
Yeah, it's a company town at the very least, and the pressures there make it so that there was an intense coercion to participate in whatever the company was up to, including these sort of very lucrative relationships with the United States Air Force and other scientific and military entities from other countries who saw this as sort of a very special, very useful thing, And of course, I've been working on this article. It's also a chapter of my forthcoming book, Anticipating the Astronaut, for close to a decade, and I've never been able to find the name of even one person who participated in one of these things. They didn't interview them. They didn't list their names. They were seen as, exactly like you mentioned from that quote, human material. It's not worthy of an interview by a journalist or having their name recorded in a study. For example, when Balki goes back to the U.S., back to Texas, to the U.S. Air Force School of Aviation Medicine, and starts the second phase of this, where he tries to replicate those the altitude tolerance that he saw in the miners at Morococha in white male airmen from the Air Force. We do find their names for sure. Their names are in the archive. They're hard to find, but I did find them.
They were also treated better too, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. They weren't treated great. They still were, camping on a mountain with Bruno Balki, which is not a fun time because he was literally a Nazi drill sergeant. But you can see the difference. It's even in something as simple as the archive of whose name gets recorded and whose doesn't. That's an indicator of a wider regime of treatment.
Absolutely. Even lab rats have names.
Yeah.
Like, it would be easier to find the name of a lab rat who participated in some medical study in the 50s than it would be. That's horrifying.
I had pet rats. They like muffins.
Excellent contribution. Thanks, Lou. I think I have a hard time in my research trying to find women in historic sources. But by and large, they are white women. There are a few black women in my research too, but once they get married, they sort of disappear from the sources, but at least they kind of have names. Like, you can find them in the records if you try hard enough. But I didn't even, and it's shame on me, I didn't even consider that there weren't any of the names of the Andean miners in the article. But now that you mention it, it is, their absence is really loud.
And one of the biggest, contributions to space history in the last decade was the book and movie Hidden Figures by Margaret Lee Shetterly. And, that helped recover the work of these amazing Black women mathematicians and computer scientists at NASA in the 1960s. This is another case of a different group of hidden figures, but it's a different type of story about race. In space history, so often we focus on these civil rights stories of Black Americans not being able to get jobs at NASA. And what's interesting about this story is that these high-altitude indigenous people in the 1950s were included. They were included in the study. Balki was very interested in their bodies and celebrated their bodies. But at the same time, you can be excluded from from a space flight by being included in a space medicine study. That's one of the interesting things that I realized in doing this research, is that normally we think of, okay, why weren't women astronauts in the 1960s? It's because by and large they weren't studied and they weren't included in sort of the space medicine laboratories and they weren't of interest. But it turns out that you can be of interest and you can be studied and you can be included included in these medical studies, but the result of that inclusion is that they are trying to use your body to improve somebody else's body, and you are not included in spaceflight, even though you're of interest to the space medicine experts. And that gets back to that inclusion by exclusion, exclusion by inclusion that you mentioned before.
Yeah, that's really horrifying to think. And like, on the one hand, thank God they didn't have the genetic abilities that we have now.
Right.
I can picture like extracting their DNA and like
totally
doing genetic engineering with their ancestral ability to live in these high altitudes.
I have a few questions, and I apologize if they're speculative or opinionated. I feel like just reading the article, I feel like Balki thought that he was being chill, like he was being more like progressive,
but like progressive for a Nazi.
yeah, like he's like, look at me, I've turned a corner, like I had that impression from that. I don't know if that's just my impression, but and the other thing too was the fact that they were doing this in Peru. Does that have anything to do that South America kind of like there was a lot of Nazis hiding there?
Oh, interesting.
Does
I hadn't even
that have
thought about
anything to do with that, or is that just, am I connecting dots that don't exactly connect?
I mean, you're definitely right that there was a large exodus of Nazis to Argentina, but Peru is sort of not really part of that story. And the reason Balki was interested in them was that this was the place where you could rent a population of people that you could experiment on without ethics.
Right, so that's like purely coincidental.
It's just rentable people in a mountainous region.
Okay.
Yeah, that's he's going there for that, and that's the only reason. Yeah, in terms of Balki turning a corner, I don't really think that he did. I really do believe that he kept all of his sort of Nazi ideology and his ideas about the perfectibility of certain humans for this sort of glorious future, which is definitely what selecting Luftwaffe pilots was all about, and brought that to bear on early ideas for the United States Air Force's concept of the astronaut, which later eventually got imported to NASA when NASA was formed in 1958. But what's really telling also is that if you read Bruno Balki's autobiography, a book called Matters of the Heart, which is a very sanitized name, also very interesting to read his account of World War II, which does not mention Adolf Hitler or the word Nazi at all. Just like how can you tell that story? Yeah, it's totally downplaying.
Like a Coco Chanel biography.
Yeah, he just uses the word "my pal" and the good old boys.
Yes.
Yeah.
He does all those tricks that, the other more famous Nazis did, where they say, I was just following orders and what I was doing wasn't politically motivated. It was purely scientific. I'm an apolitical scientist, not sort of being realistic and saying, seeing science as a social activity that always has some sort of political motivation behind it. Even though his political motivations were extremely obvious, considering that he was trying to understand the human body at altitude, not just for pure knowledge's sake, but to literally try and make a better Luftwaffe pilot to, add strength to Germany's air superiority, which was a huge part of, the secret rearmament of Germany and the Blitzkrieg plan. And there's sort of just in general expansionist plans in general. So you can see there that science is definitely politically motivated because it's trying to achieve the political end of establishing Greater Germany.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to give him any leeway. I was just asking if he thought he was being a better dude.
I think it's just keeping.
How like Mr. Burns will do something nice, but it's still really evil.
Yeah. That does clarify it for sure. Yeah. I still think that he was just sort of this very stern, very interested in when your parents are always like, oh, something is really uncomfortable and terrible, but it builds character, and they try and
like
use
Calvin's
that.
parents.
Yeah, exactly. Calvin's parents from Calvin and Hobbes. And if you read his autobiography, which is a very interesting book for many reasons, he dies after writing it. But before it's published, his family adds all these footnotes and this foreword. And they come out a couple times and say very explicitly, it was not fun having this person as your father.
Jeez.
It was one of the most crazy things I've read in like a scientist's biography, where you have these sort of snarky comments in the margins from his wife and children and stuff like that. So,
at least they got to it before it was published, and after he died.
It's like, let me tell you about the Christmas scissors. Like,
yes, there was a lot of score settling going on there. And thankfully they did that, because it helps clarify, for historians like me who we're dealing with here. It did add that level of nuance, which I tried to bring into the article as well.
Yeah, because I feel like, he was trying to sanitize the exploitative nature, like exploiting the other.
Yeah.
Identifying the other and exploiting it for the furthering of progress, regardless of which side that progress is for.
Yeah, and it's passed off as almost an assumption that it's like okay to do this, and it's okay to put your focus on perfection as the white male, and like that's sort of like, if you're interested in trying to make a better human, of course you would start with the white male as like who you're trying to improve.
Oh, and it's funny that he landed in 1950s America, because this is when you get people like Atlas. Was it Charles Atlas? No, what was his first name?
I don't know who you're talking about.
The bodybuilder.
Oh, interesting.
No, I know who you're talking about. I don't know his name.
The 1950s post-war perfect man.
The steak and eggs kind of thing.
Broad-shouldered, broad-chested, thin-waisted family man who's white and provides for his family and is physically fit and enjoys leisure time and
smokes a cigarette like his doctor tells him to.
Exactly. Always has a pack of Camels in his pockets because his doctor told him to. And
eats lead for breakfast. Yeah.
This perfect 1950s post-war masculine ideal.
Mildred, that's such an amazing point. And what's so interesting about Bruno Balki is that, he lands in America in the early Cold War. And the Cold War was like the first time when the strength of an army wasn't understood in terms of the number of soldiers it could field or the bodies of those soldiers and how strong they were. Because now you had nuclear weapons, and one nuke could just take out an entire city. And it didn't matter if that city was full of bodybuilders or whatever. There was this idea then that the body of the soldier didn't really matter anymore. And it was more about the mind. It was more about scientists trying to understand nature and create these insanely powerful weapons. But what Bruno Balki did is he said, no, in the Cold War, I refuse to, forget about the body. And he's so obsessed with the body that he says, okay, astronauts have to have this insanely, well-developed physical physique because they need to be able to resist these sort of harsh environments that they'll be headed into. So he actually at a number of different times writes different articles sort of bemoaning the physical fitness of the average Air Force enlistee, and basically says like, our military is getting, out of shape. And, I don't want to body shame anybody by using words, but he uses, terrible terms to describe people who are less fit than him. And he puts the focus on developing this very strong body, which is sort of counter the dominant narrative of the Cold War as being more about information and the mind rather than the physical body, because the history of the military before, back millennia before that, is all about how physically strong are your soldiers versus the other guys. Yeah,
you want to send a lion to war, not 10 sheep.
Exactly, and Balki thought there were too many sheep in the Air Force, and he wanted to make lions out of the astronauts. So, yeah.
I'm just looking at the time, and I don't know if you want to have any further thoughts, because I do want to. You mentioned something before we started recording that I am interested in discussing with you as a space scientist, space historian.
I'm being enveloped by cats here.
Yeah, sorry, my cats are all over the table right now.
I wish I was being enveloped by cats too. I miss cats so much. I miss cats more than humans being isolated in this pandemic.
Well, I've been isolated with these two assholes. So
get away from the board.
Yeah,
get away
just
from the
push
board.
them off the table. They're fine. Yeah, do you have any concluding thoughts before we get on to this other topic that you brought up before recording? Because we could discuss this. Like, it was a very we haven't even discussed the Evans Mount Evans situation at all.
Right.
It was a very comprehensive article that you wrote, and I think we could discuss it for hours. But I do want to chat before we sign off about this other thing.
Let's talk about it.
So Jordan mentioned before we started recording that the United States, the Pentagon, or who released the information?
Oh, it's the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, basically the intelligence community.
Okay, the American intelligence community released information about the UAP report?
Yes, so this is a report that the publication of which was triggered as part of a large omnibus bill, the Recovery Act that President Trump signed late last year. Deep in that bill was this requirement for the the intelligence community to release a report on what their classified, group that was studying unidentified aerial phenomenon, which they call UAP, which is essentially the rebranding of old UFOs. And for the last 180 days, which is exactly how long the period of time that they had to release this report, the UFO communities have been whipping themselves into a frenzy, frankly, expecting that this would be disclosure, that sort of long lusted after moment where the U.S. would come out and admit knowledge of, extraterrestrial intelligence and the existence of it. But as I predicted, this report is essentially more of the same type of thing that they've been saying in all of their previous studies of unidentified aerial phenomena or UFOs going back to 1947 with Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, which is always that people are seeing something. We don't know what that is. We are going to try and find out more about it, but we cannot draw any solid conclusions as to what these things are. So it is essentially what the previous reports have stated, and it is definitely not what the UFO community was hoping to find today. So there's a lot of disappointment online about that right now. Yeah, but
so they didn't disclose anything about Area 51 and the layers of research center that happens below the ground. And
no, they did not release any information about that. Basically, what they said is that that there are sightings that are happening. Pilots are seeing something in the sky. Their instruments are recording something, but that these mostly remain unidentified. And they say that there's a couple different problems that result in this. One is that the sensors that the planes are picking these things up on are not designed for that purpose. They're designed for other purposes. So this could be some sort of anomaly that is just intersecting with the technology in a certain way that makes something appear to be happening that isn't actually happening. And also there's no formalized reporting in place for these. So they're going to try and formalize a reporting structure so that when someone does witness something like this in the air, that there is an avenue to report it that's standardized. Right. And then that can allow sort of comparative analysis. There's also just sociological pressure amongst pilots, and this goes back to my work on astronauts. They don't like to say that they have seen something that they don't understand in the sky. There's sort of a pressure to not talk about that sort of thing.
Right.
So that needs to be overcome as well. So clearly something is being seen, something that we don't understand. But I personally, and I teach this to my students here at the University of Chicago, that it is wrong to make a leap to, an ambiguous sighting is a craft or a vehicle that implies technology or intelligent design. There is no evidence for that. These are just ambiguous sightings that people are projecting grand narratives onto, like that these are vehicles, and those vehicles are constructed by extraterrestrial intelligence that visits Earth, and that their visitation takes the form of studying us or preparing for some other nefarious activity. That is a grand narrative that is basically being spun out of thin air. And a really interesting historical analogy for this from space history is about the history of Mars exploration. Mm-hmm. And if you go back to the earliest 20th century, American astronomer named Percival Lowell was looking at Mars through a giant telescope, and he thought he could see these lines, these sort of faint lines on the surface. And he didn't just say, okay, maybe there's some lines on the surface. No, he said those lines are canals, and those canals were built by an advanced extraterrestrial civilization older than the Earth that is experiencing drought. They are politically unified, but they are suffering. And, he spun this entire story out of this vague, ambiguous sighting. And that's exactly what's happening right now with the UAPs. Of course, those lines don't exist on Mars. The whole thing was an optical illusion that people got carried away with. And the same thing is happening right now with the UAP phenomenon, I believe.
Was it like the, is it the face that's on Mars? Which is basically just pareidolia, like it's people saw a face because people want to see patterns and things.
Yeah, it looks like a face, but it's also, you'll find that face if you're looking for it.
Yeah.
Totally. So the face on Mars is a more recent version of the Percival Lowell idea. Percival Lowell's idea about the canal building civilization on Mars fell out of favor over the course of the 20th century. Eventually was killed by the Mariner 4 flyby photographs of the surface of Mars in 1965 that showed a barren, crater-marked surface. But when the Viking spacecraft arrived at Mars in 1976, they were orbiting the planet before they sent their landers down, and one of the orbiting cameras captured that picture in Cydonia that people now call the face on Mars. And then conspiracy theorists at the time in the 1970s went back to the idea that Lowell had popularized in the early 20th century, that there is an ancient advanced extraterrestrial civilization on the surface of Mars. And now the conspiracy theory is that NASA is suppressing knowledge of that.
Right. Well, you know what NASA stands for?
Never a straight answer.
Yep.
Didn't Percival Lowell get that idea from an Italian dude named Schiaparelli?
Schiaparelli, yeah. So Schiaparelli in 1877 was the first person to glimpse this phenomena on the surface of Mars, these lines. He wrote about them. He called them canali in Italian.
Yeah.
But then Lowell went a step further and basically added the sort of ET hypothesis version of, back in the early 20th century, what that would be today, to that sort of observation, and really went into story building and world building mode.
Yeah, because he was just like a trust fund kid. He had a ton of money and he had a lot of time to kill, right?
He did, but it's also that is 100% true. He built the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, with his family fortune, which I have had the chance to visit and do archival research at. But he was also, a Harvard-educated astronomer. He was a professor of astronomy at MIT, and he was a member of many famous scientific organizations at the time. So he was a legitimate scientist doing what at the time was considered legitimate science. There was definitely pushback from other scientists. It wasn't like there was consensus around his ideas, but it wasn't like he was some sort of fringe figure either. He was very much, mainstream.
He did a lot of charity work too, so I can't really knock him too bad,
And I mean, another thing that's really interesting to think about is that even though his ideas were wrong, they created an interest and an obsession with Mars that arguably has helped get actual good science done there. So, sometimes starting off on, with these incorrect fascinations, sometimes do yield genuine understanding.
Yeah, it's the scientific method. You go in with a hypothesis and prove it wrong or right. And you've done a lot of work on Mars. Like you're the Mars guy, right? Like this is you're the Mars historian at this point.
True. Yes. So my first book is about the history of astronauts, that early space medicine moment with the Nazi scientists working in America. My second book looks at how that same group of Nazi scientists were not only working on the astronaut, they were trying to understand where the astronaut might go. And at that point, it was Mars. So they built these tiny little simulations of the surface of Mars. Imagine like a little terrarium, but instead of replicating the Earth environment, they tried to replicate Mars environment in there. They called them Mars jars. And they put different forms of Earth life inside them to see what could survive, see if anything could survive in the harsh conditions on Mars. And what they found out is that some types of Earth life actually could survive there. And this tool, the Mars jar, ended up becoming like a central tool to astrobiology that astrobiologists still use today to make knowledge about Mars and also to train themselves and train their future astrobiologists how to be an astrobiologist, essentially. And what I'm really interested in is the way that the sort of Nazi military origin of this technology creates this sort of weird relationship between us and extraterrestrial life that gets built into the Mars jar. And now we don't even remember that it had this military origin, and yet it is sort of fostering this problematic relationship where we look at, even microbes on Mars, we look at them as something we can use or something that we can study or capture or manipulate for our own advantage. We sort of have gone that step beyond the ethical question of like, should we even?
Yeah, that's it's very human to see something and think, how can I exploit this?
Exactly. And the Mars jar is part of that. And I'm trying to, I've had some great experiences working with astrobiologists where I will show them, these films of, men in uniforms working with Mars jars that totally go against everything they know about the origin of their field, which they don't understand as as having a military origin. It kind of blows their mind to see, these Nazi scientists with this tool that has become central to their work, although they don't know that origin story. So my second book is called Putting Mars in a Jar, the Military Origin of Astrobiology. That's really trying to fix this problem in astrobiology by adding this hidden military chapter that no one remembers anymore.
And there's your second movie, Biodome 2.
Bring Pauly Shore back.
Bring Pauly Shore back.
Yep. If he signs on, I'll write the script.
Oh God, that was Pauly Shore and Andy Dick, wasn't it?
Was Andy Dick in it? I just remember Pauly Shore. I had a roommate
he stole that movie.
I had a roommate who had a 6-foot tall Pauly Shore poster in his bedroom.
Yikes.
Yeah, it was in my living room for a few weeks as he was moving out. It was The Anatomy of Pauly Shore. It was, yeah.
I had a James Space. We had a Pluto Nash poster.
Not to derail into a very not to derail from a very interesting and academically sound topic to Pauly Shore. But, is it even a day if there isn't a Biodome reference?
Biodome is incredibly relevant to this, that, of course, the popularization of the Biosphere 2 experiment. And that is 100% on point for exactly this ballpark that I'm working in on the Mars Jars project. So, yeah, definitely not irrelevant at all.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Pauly Shore is always making us think.
Wheezing the juice.
Something about the weasel, something. Well, I think we're coming up on a good amount of time to wrap up. Do you have any finishing thoughts or concluding words?
Where can people follow you? Things like that.
Yeah, I mean, people can follow me on Instagram or Twitter at Jordan Bim, and you can follow my research and work there. People can look up a copy of this article if they're interested. It was published in a journal called Historical Studies in the Natural Sciences. And if you Google my name and the New York Times, you can find an interview feature about my Mars Jars research that ran last summer. So if you're interested in hearing more about Nazi scientists building little models of Mars, you can find a really great story there by a science journalist called Sarah Scholes, who interviewed me.
And if you follow Jordan on Instagram, you get to see his incredible sunsets in Chicago from his insane condo that I am jealous of every day. You have cats, so I'm jealous of you. So, I mean, my view. I'm on the third floor, looking out over a train track. I can sort of see the Gladstone Hotel through my window if I crane my head nice enough. But I don't nearly have your view.
I have trash bins outside.
Nor do I have. So, Jordan, I know Jordan through my sister, and she also has great sunset views.
Mm-hmm.
So my Instagram is filled with these people with amazing, beautiful sunset views, and I have cats.
I mean, her sunset views were part of my thinking of securing this place. Like, I just needed more sunsets in my life after last summer with the Instagram sunset hour that was popular for a while there. That was definitely in my mind. But I also do overlook train tracks, and twice a day there is a CN train that comes by, rattles by, and it's definitely a homesick moment for me to see that train that's headed to Toronto. Yeah.
Before I didn't even register that was a CN was a Canadian National Railroad.
Yeah.
See, I grew up with trains, and now I work with trains.
Yeah, you're a multi-generational train boy.
Yeah, my dad.
You work with trains, Lou?
People movers. So like.
Oh, cool.
My job is I work for a company who designs like wayside systems for like metro systems like London Underground, New York subway system.
Right on.
A certain major theme parks monorail.
I'm not as dumb as I sound on the show. Oh yeah. I've gone to Disney World to work on the monorail.
Wow. Yeah. There you go. Disney was in tight with those Nazi space doctors.
Oh, they were. Yep.
No comment. I need a paycheck.
That's really cool, though.
Well, when they unfreeze Walt's head and he discovers,
you know what I love about Florida?
What do you love about Florida?
So many lizards everywhere.
Yeah,
it's I don't know, man. And you know what? I got friends in Florida. I love them.
Yep,
totally. Yep. That's Cape Canaveral's there. So.
Hold on, my cat's doing something horrible. I have to go penalize him.
Okay, the cat is scratching like vinyl records.
No.
So he's being real son of a bitchly.
No, you can't DJ. Sorry.
No, yeah, not scratching that way. Yeah, he doesn't have the two Technics tables.
My records are wrapped in tinfoil to try to get him away from it.
He's not Koala.
He beast. Naughty beast. Okay, gosh. Well, we should wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us. This was fantastic.
This was a delight.
Yeah.
And I also really dug reading that article.
Thanks so much, Lou. That means a lot coming from both of you. I'm a big fan of the show. Listen to the show. Oh. So it's a real treat to be on it, and I'm really, really appreciative of your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you're like a working academic. I'm not a working academic, so I don't have the. I've got more free time than your average scholar. So I appreciate that we were able to snag you between terms, and when coordinated after grading was done and after all your grades were in, and all the end of term fun that I get to experience on the administrative side.
Totally. Yeah, it was my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on the show.
Great. And so if you want to follow us on Instagram, we're at History for Misanthropes. If you want to email us and give your praise to Jordan, we're at historyformisanthropes@gmail.com. And of course, thank you to Valhall for our spooky tunes. And I was wrong. They don't have a new album out. They have a single for their new album that's coming out in September. So that new album, Never Sleep, is out now. And I would recommend taking a listen if you like some nightmare tunes. And yeah, thanks for listening. And thank you again to Jordan for stopping by.
Yay.
Awesome.
We'll see you next time.
Such a good show. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And scene.
All right. One more quick thing. We are doing this on a very interesting day. The U.S. intelligence community's UAP report has just come out. So if any of you want to talk about that, I am prepared to speak on that as well.
Is that about the UFO?
It is.
Not UFOs, UAPs.
Unidentified air.
Unidentified ass pussy.
Yeah.
Oh, dude, fucking high five.
This is the summer of UAP. Yeah.
This is going in the episode.
I can't claim to have my boyfriend came up with that.
Oh, boo! You stole it from.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. That's. I wish I was that clever, but no.
I am sending him flowers.
Yes. But yeah, no. I think we're definitely interested in it.